Welcome to part 2 of our Water Week series, where we look at watershed threats. The Niagara River Lake Erie watershed encompasses more than 2,000 square miles of land area and 4,000 miles of freshwater rivers and streams. Those rivers and streams drain into Lake Erie and the Niagara River, and all of that water provides Western New York with drinking water, water for crops, animals and industry, and a place for us to swim, fish, kayak, and play. Clean, fresh water is vital for our health and our economy. What is covering the land in a watershed and how the land is used has a huge impact on water quality. Depending on where you are in the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed, you may be surrounded by developed areas, shown here in red, cropland, pasture or hay, that's the yellow on this map, or forests, which are shown in green and clustered around the headwaters of our watershed, the source of our major tributaries. What happens when it rains on these different land covers? Well, we're going to model that right now. So our map on the left shows us the Cattaraugus Creek watershed. That white outline reminds us that that whole area of land drains into Cattaraugus Creek, which flows into Lake Erie. So the different colors on the map represent the different land covers, and we can see that there's a lot of forested or green land cover on this watershed. So now we're going to use the model to the right to show us what happens when it rains on a forested area. We're going to model a 24-hour rainstorm in the Cattaraugus Creek watershed. What happens to that rainwater in the forest? Well, when it rains in the forest, we can see that there's quite a lot of infiltration going on. A lot of that rainwater is going down into the soil and likely joining our groundwater. That is shown with that yellow on our model. We have a little bit of runoff in our forested, shown here with that red arrow and that small amount of red on our bar graph. But we can see that most of the water is infiltrating into the ground. If we compare that to our cropland areas, which is shown in brown, we can see that the rainwater travels on a very different path. When it rains in these areas, we can see that there's much less infiltration. Our yellow bar has gone down, and there's much more runoff on our cropland areas, shown here in the red. So the difference in land cover affects how much runoff and infiltration we have in our watershed. Our whole Niagara River Lake Erie watershed does not look like the Cattaraugus Creek watershed. Let's take a look at the Buffalo River watershed in and around the Buffalo River near downtown Buffalo. We can see that there's a lot more developed area shown in the red and the pink, from high intensity development to low or moderate intensity development. We're going to model that same storm 24-hour storm event on our high intensity developed areas in this region. So what happens when it rains there? Well, if we look, we can see that when that rainfall falls on these developed areas, we have significantly more runoff, with only a little bit of water infiltrating into the ground. That runoff, water flowing over the land, is going somewhere. And on our larger watershed, it's headed towards Lake Erie and the Niagara River. Let's take a look at what's in the runoff. Why should we be concerned? Well, we'll start in our forested areas. We remember that Cattaraugus Creek, most of that land cover was our deciduous forest. Runoff from a deciduous forest or evergreen forest area oftentimes includes dirt or sediment. And that can be a problem. It can cause our rivers and streams to look like chocolate milk. And that sediment is often carrying with it nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, things that, once they are in the waterway, cause excess nutrients in our water. That sediment can also cloud the water, making it difficult for animals to see and hunt underwater. It can clog the gills of fish and other aquatic organisms, making it harder to breathe. And it can also prevent sunlight from reaching aquatic plants, lowering the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. In our cropland areas, our runoff may contain some additional things. It's still going to carry with it some sediment, especially if that rain is happening when the fields have been freshly plowed or the plants are not quite large enough. It might also carry with it some nutrients that were added to the soil in the form of fertilizers or in the form of animal waste or manure. Some farmers also add chemicals to their crops, including pesticides and herbicides. And if applied before a rain event, those chemicals can wash off and end up with our runoff. There is a lot of different things going on in our developed area, which means a lot of different pollutants entering our waterway, often through runoff going into our storm drains. We have extra nutrients washing in from things like pet waste left by our sidewalks or streets, as well as in dirt or sediment washing into the water. And even our lawn waste, our dead leaves and grass clippings can add extra nutrients to our water. We also have what people are adding to their lawns or to local green spaces like our golf courses, and those include fertilizers as well as chemical pesticides. We see road runoff containing things like oil from cars, tire waste, and salt, which we in Western New York add to our sidewalks and roads in order to keep them from icing over. We also see a lot of litter in these areas from food waste, like our plastic cups or tipped over recycling cans. Recently, we've also seen an increase in medical waste, like masks and gloves entering our waterway. So where does all that runoff go? Well, it depends where you are in the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed. In our forested areas, it will often wash directly into waterways, into a local creek or river flowing near the forest. In our towns and communities, oftentimes the storm drains lead to sewage pipes that go directly into a local river or stream, carrying with it the runoff from the street directly into that local water body. But in a lot of our communities in Western New York, we have combined sewer systems. And so in this system, our sewage on a dry day is taken to the sewage treatment plant where it is cleaned until it can be released. We saw the Bird Island sewage treatment plant when we did our overview in Meet Your Watershed. But those sewers are connected to the storm drains in the street. And so in heavy rain events or snow melt events, that excess water coming from the storm drain overwhelms our sewer. And so in order for it not to back up into people's houses, that sewer water mixed with the storm water is released directly into a local waterway. According to a Rain Check Buffalo report, a total of 1.75 billion gallons of wastewater and untreated stormwater are estimated to enter our local waterways in a typical year. So what are the consequences of all this runoff entering our waterway? Well, excess nutrients from runoff and sewer overflows cause algae populations to grow or bloom. Some algae can even be toxic. When large algal blooms die off, the decomposition process uses the oxygen in the water, resulting in huge fish die-offs. Toxic algal blooms or high bacteria levels caused by runoff and sewage overflows can shut down our favorite beaches in the summer. Fish and other wildlife can also die from the effects of excess sediment or by consuming plastic that washes into our waterways. Sensitive organisms like frogs and other amphibians can alert us to toxins and chemicals in the water. And finally, we're starting to see, and especially in our developed areas, that with nowhere for this water to go, we have more flooding in our communities. And these effects are just being compounded already by climate change. In the Great Lakes region, we've seen a 35% increase in heavy precipitation events since 1950. So that means more sewer overflow and more flooding. We've also seen our annual temperature rise 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1950s. And those higher temps bring things like heat stress and less lake ice and less snow, but also a more favorable environment to our invasive species, which might result in more crop pests and competition with native species. So it's more important than ever that we understand what's happening in our watershed. And that's where our Day in the Life of the Niagara River Lake Erie Watershed comes into play. Join us next time to learn about this event and how we are gathering information on what's changing in our community.